What is up? Okay, so this is a video I've been wanting to make for a while, and it's been something I've thought about for a long time. So I used to be in the left, the very, very far left, and all of these are realizations that came to me over a long span of time, right? So this video is basically about how far left Marxism is a secular form of Christianity. And to some that may come as a shock because generally far left ideologies describe themselves as atheist and they describe themselves against traditional Western values. But there are so many striking parallels between not so much like the superficial top layer storytelling, but the function of different aspects of each ideology. And that's what we're going to go over now. So thanks for tuning in. Sorry if the audio quality and the video quality isn't great. This is my first video I've ever made. If you like this, be sure to leave a comment, like, and subscribe if you want, or send me a message and tell me what you think. Or if you don't like it, you can do that too. I don't care. But let's get right into it. So the first notion is this notion of the big other. So what the big other is, it's an abstraction, an abstract idea, or something like a god, through which you can justify your actions and give your actions meaning, give your life meaning. And I mean, this is huge, right? So like, if you read Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, he basically describes that meaning is the most important thing, and people necessarily need to have meaning and create their own meaning in their life. So this goes back into that. But with the big other, it manifests in different ways. For Christianity, it's obviously God. For all monotheistic religion, it's just God. Your actions are justified and given meaning through their relationship to your notion of God. For leftist Marxists, it can be a little bit more varied, but things like history, progress, revolution, the masses, these sorts of things have been used to justify and give meaning to different actions that far left ideologues have done throughout history. And this to some degree relates to the USSR. Actually, the first time I ever heard this theory is from Zizek, right? I'm not a huge Zizek fan, but there's some video online bouncing around where he's comparing like kind of quote unquote Stalinist Russia and talking about history and class struggle being a sort of big other through which everything could be justified. In today's left, I think it's a little bit more varied. They'll talk about like equality or the masses or the people, or just revolution. And for them, that's their big other. Like that's what everything points to in their minds. So there's that. That's the number one way that Marxism is secular Christianity. The second primary way that Marxism is secular Christianity is that both are secular slave religions. As Nietzsche described it, a secular slave religion or a secular slave morality is effectively a means by which the lower classes are made to feel better about their own station in life. So what they'll do is they'll take their own qualities and call those virtues, while what they see as the qualities of the higher classes, they'll describe those as vice and evil. So with Christianity, it's humility, a kind of plain lifestyle, filial devotion. These sorts of things are seen as virtues, and a kind of haughtiness or decadence, wastefulness, this is seen as a vice. Same thing with leftist Marxism, only probably to a higher degree. So they'll see poverty itself as a virtue, essentially, and it's extremely silly. But I mean, that's literally their effective emotional disposition, I should say. I don't know if it's necessarily like a thought out intellectual thing where they're like, oh yes, poverty is virtue, but that is their emotional disposition. And they'll do this with other things as well. They'll see things like, they'll just valorize being lower class itself. And it's part of a resentment to, as I said, make them feel better about their own station in life. But it's also a very destructive mindset as well whenever it's given room to take power, because it's not so much creative, right? It's not like we don't want to help people rise the ranks of hierarchy. We don't want people to become successful today. Instead, we want to destroy the higher class, and somehow that will make a better world. So it's an interesting aspect of both Christianity, but especially far left Western Marxism today. The third part is that both have their vision of heaven, right? We all know Christianity. Well, the image of Christianity, it's up in the sky, there's clouds, your family's there, blah, blah, blah. Peace, it's nice. But for Western Marxism, they have the same thing. It's a stateless, classless society that they call communism, which they assume will just be this paradise, which, it's utopian by the sound of it, but it's such a fantasy that there's no real clear, concrete explanation of how that would even work, right? There's always little micro hierarchies everywhere in life. Anywhere there's a social relation or a group setting, there's a hierarchy, an informal hierarchy happening. And Marxists will counter and say, well, it's the lack of formal hierarchy. But then it's the question of, well, how do you get shit done? And they'll be like, oh, well, it's democratic, blah, 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 blah. But if we're talking about complex technological societies, that's just a bridge too far, right? Like, you're not gonna have a coherent society that's kind of autonomously ran without hierarchical power structures to give them form. But in the leftist version of the end of history, of heaven, the end goal for all their virtue is a stateless, classless society, which would somehow happen. Like, it's so abstract that that's another thing about leftism, is it's all abstract, right? There's nothing concrete about it. Like, we can see that this has never happened in history, right? It's not for lack of trying. There have been socialist revolutions. They're market economies now. They have classes. Only one political party. That's the main difference, is there's only one political party. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing either. I don't want to get it twisted. I don't want you to think that that's the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that their version of heaven has never been created on earth. But nonetheless, that's the kind of paradise that they see, similar to that Christians have their version of paradise, beyond earth paradise. Marxists have their version of beyond history paradise. And this goes back to my fourth point of the fourth similarity between Christianity and Marxism, is that they both have a notion of original sin. So for Marxists, it's Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Heaven. Eve gets the apple from the snake. She offers it to Adam, they eat it, they get expelled from the Garden of Eden. They went from paradise to earth, to suffering, to pain. So Marxists have a similar thing, where they have this notion called primitive communism. And this is just Marx's way of saying like a pre-agrarian society, right? Kind of formal class structures and hierarchies really began to develop and solidify, at least complex ones, with agrarian societies. So Marx's speculation was that pre-agrarian societies were largely higher. They didn't have a hierarchy, or at least they didn't have specific classes that were exploiting each other, and that this was, this was paradise, prehistory paradise, similar to the Garden of Eden. So regardless of whether or not that's true or not, it still functions in a very similar way in both ideologies, where you have this original sin that's introduced. Like I said, for Christianity, it is the apple. For Marxism, it comes down to something like capitalism or class society, or what's common today is racism, like, racism just dropped from the sky. That's another interesting thing that leftists will say, right? They'll be like, oh, racism is taught, it's not natural, it's learned. But then it begs the question of, where did people first learn, or who first taught racism? Like, it's a chicken or the egg sort of scenario. But back to my point, both Marxism and Christianity do have an original sin, that being the apple, or racism, class society, capitalism, these sorts of things. My fifth point is that both Marxism and Christianity have patron saints. I don't know all the patron saints in Christianity. I assume it's like Paul and all of these people. For Marxists, it's obviously Marx, Lenin, Mao, Gramsci, various figures throughout history, Rosa Luxemburg, who Marxists look up to and, obviously only see the good parts of their life, or only, are aware of in their selective focus. I mean, we all have selective focus, so it's not like that's the bad thing, but it functions the same way in both. It's a very interesting parallel. Then my next point is that in both, sin is somewhat internal. And this is particular to modern day SJW or far left Marxism, right? Kind of cultural revolution Marxism. For Christianity, it's, the internal coveting of one's wife is the sin, or the internal greed, the internal reputation of Jesus, or repudiation of Jesus. These are all the sins, not the actions, right? This is something that's very particular to Christianity as well. It's not necessarily true in all traditional religions, but it is true. That is this narrative in Western Christianity. In SJW Marxism as well, it's very similar. It's like during the Cultural Revolution in China, it was quote unquote being a capitalist rotor, or being a quote unquote revisionist, having these wrong ideas. And today in the West, it's, like SJW leftists will speculate on your intentions, right? They'll be like, oh, in your heart you're a racist because you said this, that I can extrapolate to mean this, and it never comes down to a virtue ethics, right? It's very internal for SJW Marxists. It's all about what you believe and say, not so much what you do, not so much your habit or your actual character built through habit. So that's another interesting aspect to both Christianity and Marxism. Let's see, my eighth point is that both, because they're ideologies, they're subject to ideological splits, right? And because they're ideologies, they have a very important function of bringing people together into a group with a shared ideology, right? It provides like an in-group feeling. You can say, this is us, they're them. If somebody deviates, you're not us. They don't like us because they're them. We don't like, it goes back and forth. But because of this, both are subject to very strong splits. It happens all the time. That's because insofar as these do function as in groups, power can be gained in relationship to those groups. So you have, let's say, like Western Trotskyism, and then within that ideological grouping, there's only so much room for esteem and popularity and status, right? There's going to be some ideological leaders, some people who won't gain a following. So what they can do is split. They can essentially say that, oh, we have these different ideas, even though it's more or less the same, but we have a different interpretation of USSR. Was it a deformed worker state or a revisionist proletarian dictator? It's all these weird abstractions. It goes back to all those abstractions, but they can blow these issues up and split and create like a separate mini trend, sectarian trend. Yeah. So this occurs both within Christianity and Western Marxism as well, and this also raises a lot of other tertiary issues as well, because you can gain power through these ideological institutions. It also opens the way for kind of predatory behavior on the part of authorities within them, who are typically given more esteem, more trusted, things like this. So you have obviously the problems in the Catholic Church and things like that. And then, I mean, it's less publicized, but there's certainly no shortage of people who are ideologically esteemed within these trends. I don't want to say taking advantage of women, because women naturally gravitate towards leaders, but I would say that using their position of authority to their sexual advantage, which is obviously, that's a sexual strategy. But it's interesting that would appear in both Marxism and Christianity. I already talked about how both are an outlet to seek meaning. Both are part of an identity and internal psyche. So this is psychology. So this is interesting, because this is why you will never convince a leftist, and you will never convince a Christian to give up their beliefs, because you're not discussing ideas with them for them. You are discussing part of their core identity, right? This is what they identify with. So there's no amount of logic or reason that's going to dissuade them from that, unless, I mean, there are ways you can kind of like hit them where it hurts emotionally, and that's probably the best way, like simply pointing out how being part of an ideological trend is a detriment to their life, and is pointing out the contradictions within it, things like that, the livid contradictions, but even then, I would say like pointing out how it's against one's self-interest and against one's emotional health to be part of these ideologies. But nonetheless, whenever you are debating them on a rational level, they don't necessarily see it as you questioning ideas, but rather you questioning their identity. So it's very hard to debate them on a rational level. And I guess that's most of it. But I think, like I said, I think there are very strong parallels between Marxism and Christianity, how they function as more or less secular slave moralities within the Western zeitgeist throughout history. It used to be Marxism was very common. It gave meaning to the lower classes. Now it's become much more, at least for some people, not everyone, but for some people, it's become this kind of far left SJW Marxism, which is almost exclusively popular in the West, right? I want to emphasize that, because what you have Marxist parties in Asia and Latin America, and not all of them subscribe to these ideas, right? The kind of more out there ideas, like the tranification of society, total equality, things like this. I mean, the Communist Party of China, right? They're the biggest communist party in the world, and they're banning BTS because they're too gay, right? They're promoting masculinity drives. They understand that you can't have a successful society based on paused values. So I want to emphasize that, just finally, is that what I talked about here today was mostly about the modern leftist SJW Marxism that's common in the West. But it's interesting to think about if you have any other ideas about how they're parallels. They both kind of reflect the same functions as religion. Drop it in the comments. My cat's being kind of noisy. Sorry about that. Anyways, have a great day. Talk with you later.